Hello. This video submission will be responding to the 9 prompts found in the discussion paper, the Disability Standards for Education Review. So these prompts are targeted towards teachers and teacher educators. We'll be responding as a team, the Learning Intervention team from the Melbourne Graduate School of Education at the University of Melbourne. This team is led by Professor Lorraine Graham, who joins me right now. And Lorraine, would you like to introduce the Learning Intervention team?
Certainly. So we are a multidisciplinary team and we work at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. We all have professional experience based in inclusive education and the concern for supporting students who have difficulties learning, maybe because of a disability, maybe because of some other reasons. With the Learning Intervention team, we have 3 specializations in learning difficulties, disability, and deaf education. Our team is led by Sharon Cleavey as the coordinator of the Master of Learning Intervention, and also a member of our team is Dr. Lisa Mackay-Brown, who is a Program Director of Professional Education in NGSE. And the mastermind who's put together our video submission and really given us the opportunity to think about the DSE and contribute to this review is Dr. Matthew Harrison, who you've already met. And we'd like to thank Matthew for giving us a chance to have our voices heard. So these are our responses to those 9 key questions for educators and teacher educators.
One of the important provisions of the Disability Standards for Education is the right for students to enrol in a school of their choice, most likely their local school, and ensuring that the students and the families are given the information that they require, but also barriers to enrolment are not put in their place. So I guess from my experience as a teacher, working particularly with young people with mental health disorders and comorbid disabilities, and being an outreach teacher that was supporting families to enrol in school settings. So not enabling the student to enrol easily without the parents having to provide a lot of information that wouldn't normally be asked of other families enrolling their child. And this information that was being asked wasn't necessarily being used in order to plan for reasonable adjustments for this child, but were more being used to, I guess, vet or work out whether or not that young person would be allowed to even enrol in their school. We found we were spending a lot of time with advocacy work with families and sitting with them in meetings with schools to ensure that the families were not being either directly or indirectly discriminated against through the enrolment process. I think other things that we found with the DSE was that enrolment information wasn't always being made available in a format that could support the family. Very often we were working with even secondary age students who may have difficulties accessing the amount of printed information that was provided and the, I guess, the difficulty level of some of the information that was provided. Also families, particularly parents who had quite significant literacy issues, their ability to actually access the information and to be able to complete and fill out the requisite forms as part of the enrolment process was something that presented a barrier for families. So that meant us doing things like taking time to sit with the families and actually fill out the information with them, because they weren't able to access this on their own in order to enrol their student. So for me, areas that need to be considered with the disability standards is firstly that schools do understand their obligations with regards to enrolment and a student attending their local school. They also need an awareness of the information being provided and what is fair and reasonable for the family to have to provide before being allowed to enrol. So I think for me, there are a couple of my main thoughts or comments about enrolment and access.
Yeah, and I guess one of the things that I think teachers often have difficulties with is that understanding of using technology as a support to allow kids to be at equal footing. But sometimes they see it as an advantage. So for children who might have dysgraphia, who can't write legibly, then you would say that, you know, a reasonable adjustment would be allowing them to use a keyboard. And then teachers would say, well, that's not fair because other kids aren't able to use a keyboard. So sometimes those adjustments are seen as advantaging, particularly when you get into senior secondary and you're looking at allowing those kinds of adjustments in sort of assessments and exams and things like that. So teachers understanding around equity and what equity means in terms of opportunity and accommodations and modifications is something that's not well understood, I think, particularly in the secondary school. And the other thing is about that consistency of accommodations across secondary school. So teachers having the time and the capacity and provided with support to have those conversations about students who require accommodations and support, to make those accommodations and support consistent across classrooms, and for teachers to share with each other about what works for what students. And I think that, again, that level of communication is not happening at a secondary level, or being allowed and supported and give time given to teachers to have those opportunities to really develop a better understanding of students as learners. I guess the other thing is around students whose disabilities are invisible. So things like language impairment, or things like deafness to a degree as well. So that idea is, if students can converse at a reasonable level, that's some of the difficulties that they have in their language, in their literacy and in their written language, are not visible necessarily, or are not well understood, particularly for children in terms of accessing the curriculum and having those supports to allow them to access it. So just because their disability is not visible or really visible, sometimes that leads people to not providing adequate accommodations and modifications for those students.
So I've seen the support that teachers have provided from a number of different roles over my career. And that's as a teacher myself, as a researcher, and as an academic. I think that the long history now, in 15 years of influence that the disability standards for education have had, it's made a big difference. As a teacher educator, someone who's been involved in this area since 1994, which was one of the first compulsory subjects offered for pre-service teachers, right through to the present, you can see a big growth in awareness in terms of what teachers can do to support the students in their care. And I think one of the most important things has been the acknowledgement of how important it is to work as part of a team, so that teachers, parents, school leaders, allied health professionals and paraprofessionals, everyone who's involved in the delivery of education and well-being. They need to work together in order for students to really feel and to be supported. I think that at this time, whenever you talk about instructional leadership in a meaningful way, and that touches on those key phrases from the disability standards of on the same basis and reasonable adjustments, whenever you talk about instructional leadership, you do think of those sorts of concepts. And I believe that over the 15 years of the DSE, it's gone from instructional leadership as a new term to now what's really required is inclusive instructional leadership, so that all planning, it is planning with all of the students in the class in mind, and all leadership really looks at the whole student body. That the move to what we want for a future education, it really has to be what we want for all students. And in many ways, the general thought about what's current and important in education has been informed by a lot of the kind of instruction that people who are really committed to supporting students who might have difficulties in learning, what they've uncovered and been working with for some, for some years. So I see that as becoming now part of the whole discourse for what we talk about in terms of education and educational change. To me, it is a total valuing of diversity and the idea that if we think about, standards for the sort of education we want for all Australian students, then that's one where, as far as possible, barriers are removed and access and participation is maximised for all students. And when you think about some of the practicalities of supporting students in such a context, it's using the kind of metrics and assessment that we're now having access through because of technology to really build very good learner profiles that help guide this sort of responsive teaching based on evidence that we can feel sure about as educators. And this sort of instruction that looks to develop the student looks to develop the whole child, the whole student, and is concerned with their well-being as well as the content, foundational content that they have to develop, but also the sorts of capabilities that are important in this changing and uncertain world. So these are the sorts of things like communication, cooperation, creativity, collaboration, but also compassion and a focus on what's common between all learners and between all humans rather than what's different.
So part of us when we're working with teachers is to help them understand about when should they be when and how are the best ways to support students with disability, and thinking about what are the evidence-based approaches that they can implement for their students, for each student's particular needs, but also about understanding about having evidence alone is not appropriate. It's not sufficient, but also thinking about how do they implement those different supports within their setting to get the best outcomes for their students. So it's not only about the evidence, but around the implementation and how that's supported, and really ensuring that what they do can be sustained and can be embedded within their settings. The other thing that we really think about is that intersection between health and the school system. So how do professionals work together to ensure that all the support that students need are met and are provided to them in a comprehensive, cohesive, and through continuation, so that things don't get lost from year to year or from teacher to teacher or from professional to professional. And that we know that because it's, that health sector provides such a different type of support, it really needs to be wedged in or complemented or embedded within what education does as well. So they're not necessarily seen as two separate systems supporting students, but really putting those students at the centre and then ensuring that they receive all the support they require, regardless of where that support has been provided from. And that comprehensiveness is that real challenge.
I'd like to speak from the perspective of special schools, and then I'll have a story about child with a disability in mainstream schools as well. So within my experience in special schools, I have many times seen children who don't have a voice. So they're non-verbal children and they don't have free communication capacity, who have had bruising from other students and unable to say what's happened. Yeah, they're clearly upset. There's clearly a mark on them from the playground and we can't know what actually happened. And this can be really distressing and traumatic for that child because they don't know how to say what's going on, and we don't know how to deal with that and how that happened. And so it just really highlights for me the need for really good training in AAC, so assisted communication technology, and to allow students ways to communicate, and for us to really be supervising these very vulnerable students, really well supervising, and which is what we had to do in this case, was we had to really watch and see what was going on, to watch what was happening in the future, because it was a recurring thing. And we did get down to the bottom of it, but it's just a really interesting one when a child can't go home and tell mum what happened, but mum, they can come home and they have a bruise and they're upset and we can't know what's happened. Yeah. Within mainstream, oh, is it interesting? I know a family that has, the children were in my class. I taught all three of these children in a special school. They were 1 year apart and they were all children who went to an SDS. So they were non-verbal children with intellectual disability in the one family, 3 kids. And they were dual enrolled in the local primary school as well. And the first child went in and it went really well in prep. And then the next year, the second child went in. First child stayed in prep and his brother came into prep as well. Third year, he stayed in prep, his brother stayed in prep, and then his sister came into prep. And this school had this idea that because the intellectual capacity was low, that they wouldn't be able to cope with more than prep. And because prep was play-based, that was all they were willing to offer. And this was what they called inclusion. And we had to really work with this school for them to understand, as the special school, what the capacity of the child was and how we can progress these children up to grade 6. They allowed the children to progress up to grade 2, and then the oldest stayed in grade 2 and ended up being 12 in grade 2 until his mother decided that and understood, but she didn't know the difference, and the school believed they were doing good inclusion, but it was actually just really I don't know what we would call that a really narrow view of inclusion. So the school were kind, they were the students were kind, but they were treated as sort of dolls. They were treated as the cute kids in the class. They weren't treated as equals. Everyone was kind, but it was not an equal footing of a child in a classroom. Yeah, they were allowed to pretty much do whatever they wanted, and they were followed around by a teaching assistant, but they were in a room of younger children, right? So they weren't following the same curriculum. They weren't expected to do the work. They were really there just to be socialized. And yeah, so as a teacher trainer, I would recommend that the teaching staff at this school build their own capacity, for one thing, to understand social skills and how to teach them, and also to build the capacity of the other peers to include these children on an equal basis. So creating an environment and a culture that embraced difference rather than treated it as something fragile or something cute, which was kind of how they were treated.
So although I haven't heard of any instances where parents have actually argued that teachers haven't met their obligations under the DSE, there have been a few times where I myself have challenged other teachers or people in curriculum capacities as staff about meeting the needs of students who are struggling in different ways. So I'm not sure if parents are aware of the legislation sometimes, or sometimes parents don't want to come right in and talk about legislation straight away because it's like bringing in the big guns when they're really trying very hard most of the time, I find, to create these collaborative relationships with teachers because they know that that will get the best outcomes for their children. So I'm not sure why they usually don't do that, but yeah, it could be lack of awareness. That's a possibility. But in terms of me myself challenging teachers, I would usually start with some more, suggestions and things. And certainly, it takes sometimes a long time to really collaborate well with other teachers and that sort of thing, and that can take years. So again, I wouldn't be coming in straight away with the legislation, but sometimes I feel like there is a need to just remind people. And I have had a situation in the past where there was a little, one of my students who was, the task that was, that he was working on was way beyond his capacity, and he was having emotional breakdowns at home. His parents were ringing me. I was trying to talk to the teacher about ways that she could better accommodate his needs in terms of modifying the task, but it was quite difficult, and in the end I said, look, actually there's some legislation around this and it's really important that we comply with this legislation. And it was after that then, some accommodations were made. So sometimes there is a place for it, and it's very important that this legislation is there, but I haven't seen many parents actually come out and talk about it with teachers or challenge teachers on it. And by and large, I should say, I found that teachers are often trying really, really hard to accommodate the needs of their students. But the biggest thing that happens in schools, from what I can see, is that they are constrained by time. So there's pressure to cover the curriculum at a speed which is often, I feel, not compatible with the needs of even up to a third of the learners, I would say. And many teachers have relayed to me that they feel challenged by this and wish that they could cover fewer concepts in more depth so the bulk of students could keep pace. But teachers are they're under pressures from upstream because schools are competing for those high academic averages. So until, in my opinion, until these types of systemic problems are addressed, accommodating the needs of diverse learners will remain challenging for teachers. But I should also say the NCCD is a really positive move from what I can see, because there are now accountability measures in place to ensure that teachers do differentiate. So in the past, although the legislation was there was no, people were not necessarily aware of it, but now they have to be aware of it, and this is changing the culture in schools, I believe, and teachers are becoming much more conscious of it. And I should also say that schools haven't necessarily provided teachers with the extra planning and collaboration time or the increased staffing to deal with this. So teachers now have this double whammy where they're covering the curriculum at a certain pace because that's what's required, but they're also having to cover it in a certain level of depth and differentiate to the needs of different learners. And there's a study or a survey, teacher survey in New South Wales, that's found that teachers are actually feeling anxious about this. And that's certainly been my experience too, is really teachers are very good will, and they want to do the best for their students, but they're feeling very pressured at the moment. If I was giving advice to parents about, how to go about approaching schools, if they feel that the school is not making those reasonable adjustments, I would say that most parents are really conscious of that extra time and resources that their children with disabilities and difficulties require from schools. And as such, I find most of them take a really collaborative approach, and they're conscious of keeping a balance between establishing a relationship with the teacher to advocate effectively for their child, and also not imposing so much that it puts teachers offside, because I think they're conscious of the time constraints that teachers are under. And I think this is a really useful approach, and that parents, use the legislation, I guess, as a last resort. So if you've tried other strategies first, and still you've got a child who is not learning, or they're very traumatised by school and would almost be better served by being at home, then it may be a good idea to remind the school of their obligations under the legislation. But as a first port of call, I wouldn't take that approach, because it's often perceived as an aggressive stance, and it can create defensiveness among teachers. And this relationship is so important. This collaboration between the parents and the teachers is so important, because that leads to the best outcomes for learners.
Again, in my role as a teacher, but also still working in a research project in particular with young people with mental health disorders who are disengaged from schooling, transitions can be a really difficult time for them. And very often transitions for children or young people with disability can be treated in the same way as for their non-disabled peers. Some of the particular needs that I've seen with the cohorts that we work with are students requiring additional time in the new school environment to get used to the spaces, to learn their way around, to know who they can go to for additional support. Other things I've found too is when the young person has transitioned into the space, a lot of the supports that are initially provided for these students when they do move into the new setting are removed really quickly. So supports that they've been provided with as part of, say, moving into year 7 and learning how to understand timetables, finding their right materials, finding their way around, meeting new peers and working with new people. These things in particular are taught quite well, I've found in general, to all students in that first sort of term. But then after that time, a lot of these supports or expectations are removed, and the young person with disability may actually need additional time in order to really embed themselves into the setting. I think too, a number of the conditions that students face upon transition, being in a new setting, are not always considered as possible barriers or impediments to them engaging in the school setting. So the speed of instruction in a secondary setting can be particularly difficult for students, as can things like just the noise and movement. And while these might seem, you know, not that important on, you know, a surface level, when we're talking with young people who have particularly heightened levels of anxiety or a difficulty connecting with peers or even asking help, transitioning into a new setting and not having a good sense or understanding of these things can be quite detrimental for those young people. I think too, schools could improve the way that they get information from the previous setting. So very often, particularly in the setting or the type of young people I work with school refusal, very often these young people have shown quite significant signs of possible school disengagement or being at risk of disengagement in the primary school setting. But these sort of questions around attendance and engagement aren't being asked as part of the transition process between schools. And so for young people who are quite at risk, the early warning signs are not being picked up, they're not being transferred, that information is not being transitioned. And so suddenly we have young people who are not attending school after the first 2 weeks, and schools not being aware of the fact that these were young people that they really needed to keep checking in with and understanding what their needs were at this time. So I think for me, the couple of main things that we need to consider around transitions for students with disability is a more intensive and supported transition process based on their needs, of course, because of course some young people with disability won't need that, but we need to have an awareness of the variability of need at transition or the point of transition, and schools need support in order to work through these processes with the individual students. But also the provision of information between services needs to be considered in a more detailed and a more, I guess, structured way, so that all of the possible pain points or barriers to engaging in the new setting have been clearly highlighted, have been thought about and considered as part of the transition. And that also includes any interventions that have been in place in the prior setting or the previous setting. These need to be carefully considered how these get transitioned into the new setting, so those supports aren't just pulled away from the young person as well. So thank you.
So speaking as an educator in the context of working with children who are deaf or hard of hearing, some of the things that have supported students who've transitioned both from early intervention into primary school, between primary school and secondary school, and also from secondary school either to tertiary education and also into workplaces, has been the development of the ability to have self-advocacy voice in those students. So what we see often that's quite effective is students who have, over those different transitions and throughout their educational history, developed an ability to talk about what they need, to identify what helps them be successful in school situations and education situations, and to identify areas in which they might experience challenges. So often when our students come into primary school, we find that they have a good understanding of what might support them to increase their access to the school system and to the communication that occurs, both in terms of the academics in their classroom and as well as the social aspects of engaging in a school situation. So families are often very involved at that stage, but one of the key things that really seems to support students to develop these skills is their relationship with the educator. So when that teacher is able to be responsive to the needs that the family and the child express, and to have some information and knowledge and willingness to explore different ways for that student to be really engaged in their learning, as well as engaged in the relationships with teachers and peers in that school, those transitions seem to be quite successful. So being able to listen to the teachers' voices from previous years and access that information that tells them perhaps what has supported that student to engage well, to access information, to be able to express their own challenges and what strategies and situations might help them, both in small children coming into school, but also in students that are going into transition, both for workplace from secondary school, and especially that key time from primary school to secondary school. So when educators are able to be responsive to the needs that students express, we find that those students are then able to grow in confidence in their ability to understand themselves, what supports them to really feel comfortable and to perhaps do their best both socially and academically in that situation, but also develop not only the understanding of what will help them, but how to express that best in a variety of different ways. And it's not just a one-off conversation. So as that relationship develops, it's often about checking in as to whether or not the things that they first thought would be helpful are actually helping them in the way that they expected. So small children won't know exactly what prep is going to look like, and children moving into secondary school may not initially be able to predict all of the things that will be supportive and all of the things that might be challenging for them. So being able to include that student voice throughout their education as they come to realise what are the most supportive and facilitative aspects of education, and what are the most challenging, and what are the things that can be done, I think, both in the environment, in the way that the teaching's set up, in the way that the environment in the classroom is set up, but also in terms of what strategies and skills and abilities and knowledge we can help the child to develop as well. So that we're working in both spheres, in the sphere of the educational setting, but also in the sphere of recognising and developing the child's abilities as well. And I think educators have got a really key opportunity to have an impact on both of those different areas. And children who experience positivity right throughout that journey seem to have really good experiences and outcomes as they move through those different transition processes. Thank you.
Do you know, the other thing I think, though, that in terms of the being able to understand which kids require accommodations and which don't, is again, it's sitting at that secondary level where there's not really good assessments that are being done to identify kids with language and literacy and even numeracy issues, and then being able to target the supports at where they're at. So I think that assessment at that secondary level, particularly at transition, is really lacking. So that means that often students are kind of into their secondary education without being identified, and that can lead often to behavioural issues, and then the behaviour is what's targeted rather than the supports for access and participation.
Yeah.
I think for me, so I taught in a school where it was 100% Indigenous in an old mission in Queensland, and it was secondary. So I guess the ways in which we tried to work with the students is, you know, the relationality and reciprocity that you build with the community was extremely important. You know, we worked with the liaison officers. We had uncles and aunties that had jobs within the space, and so we were able to find out information about the students before they even came to the school, because most of the kids were related to the aunties and uncles who already worked within the school. So that was beneficial for us. But as I said, we were secondary. So the kids may have been tested down at the primary school, which was state, but we were a independent secondary school. And so that kind of data was never actually shared with us. So we had to find ways in which to get that information. Basically, it was through the parents, but also through the parents via the liaison officers. So, but then there was also trying to build relationships with the state school to have them share the data, but that wasn't always happening. I mean, most of our kids had otitis media, so glue ear, and so there was difficulties in hearing, and so we were aware of that, and we put in microphone. Teachers had the microphones and the speakers at the back of the room to just adjust that and address that straight up. Like each classroom had the microphones, yes, and so forth.
And were teachers trained in how to use that equipment, or was it just sort of a potluck draw?
Oh, it was karaoke. No, there was, I think someone came to demonstrate it, but there was no real training per se. I mean, the problem was it's an Indigenous community, so we were a good 2 hours drive from Rockhampton, which is more or less a rural town. That was the biggest rural town nearest to us, and so it's the costs that are involved of getting people to community that seem to be quite a deterrent.
Yes.
That's not actually factored within the funding.
Yeah.
I guess for me, because of the Indigenous perspective, it's always about that relationality and rapport that you can build with not just the students, but with the parents as well. And any of the other key workers that are working with the child. So we had situations where the kids we had health workers coming into the school. We had youth justice coming into the school, and so forth. So it was building that kind of community around the students. So I guess if I was to be teaching a teacher candidate these days, I think it would be being aware of the key stakeholders within that child's support. And for us in particular, see, in Queensland, we had to have individual education plans for each child. for each Indigenous child. So it was kind of mandatory in a way that you had to work with all of those influencing factors and getting to know the child. The most undervalued person within the schooling system is the liaison officers or the Koori workers or whatever you want to call them. But they are the most valuable members of the schooling community, particularly for Indigenous kids and particularly for teachers. So a way in which you can, because I was on community, we actually would go to the family houses to see them. If a new teacher came to the school and they tried to go to the family house without the liaison officer, the family wouldn't open the door. So it's more the introductions and being able to, sometimes teachers don't really know how to communicate with parents. They like to use highfalutin words. The liaison officers can translate the teacher talk. And I think that's really important too, because parents, particularly because it was a remote community, the educational attainment of the parents wasn't that particularly high either. So you had to, you couldn't come to them at a high level. And most of the times, unfortunately, teachers only spoke to the parents when the kids were in trouble, rather than celebrating the achievements of the child and kind of trying to change that relationship that a parent that saw the school number on their phone, on their mobile, trying to contact them, wouldn't answer the phone because they knew that their child was in trouble. But I guess I would specifically call parents up to the school just to do a happy dance whenever they did something amazing for the day, just so that it's exactly that. It's changing that narrative.
I think one of the things around, it's generational issues around language. So if a parent has had a hearing issue, if they're Indigenous and they've had a middle ear issue and that's impacted their learning of language, even if that resolves as they get older, then that impacts on the next generation. So not only does the next generation have a really high possibility of middle ear issues themselves, they've also got that double whammy of their parents having had restricted language exposure and having language issues. So it's not just the hearing that starts to impact, it's around that language, history of generational language deprivation as well. And I guess the other thing is behaviour. So the behaviour and some of the issues that can come around behaviour when you're not hearing what's going on, when you're not understanding what's going on. So therefore it can manifest into behaviours of avoidance or frustration and all of those sorts of things. So it's really important that when we're considering Indigenous kids, that we look at language and we look at hearing as well, and history of hearing, to help us understand perhaps some of those compliance issues or some of those behavioural issues that might be occurring, and we really look at, well, what is the reason behind those, rather than looking at it as a behavioural issue rather than a language or an access issue.
My name's Claire Redenbach. I'm a teacher at a special developmental school, and I lecture and research at Melbourne Uni as well. We have one student that we know of at our school who is gender non-conforming. And this didn't come out until after our school did some work with the Victorian Equal Opportunities and Human Rights Commission. After we'd done some work with VIROC, we hosted a family afternoon and had families from the whole school come and discuss what was important for their needs and the needs of their children. So we have a really culturally and linguistically diverse group of families at our school. And one of the things that came about was one of the mums said to another family, my autistic child has come out as transgendered. And I don't think this mum realised at the time that she was talking to a family, the transgendered family. And it was just a really fantastic and natural conversation. And they were able to get the ball rolling as to what their kids needed. And basically what their kids needed was just to have their identity normalised and not pointed up. There were some initial concerns around how the students would respond to this student changing their identity. We'll give them a pseudonym. We'll say this student, Jake, had decided to become Lulu. And from day dot, the principal and all of the teachers would ask Jake, Lulu, who do you want to be today? And they would answer Lulu. So ever since then, they've been referred to, and I think nomenclature is really important, as Lulu. Some of their friends call them Jake Lulu, and none of them are bothered by it at all. The biggest concern for these kids having an intellectual disability was just remembering that their friend had a new name. As a teacher trainer, I would advise other teachers to start by asking their student what they want and how they want to be referred. Being that my students have intellectual disabilities, we use a lot of visual prompts for our communication. I have photos of this student, and two exact photos. One says Jake, one says Lulu, and I ask them, who are you today? Because according to their mum, that's subject to change, and they tell me, and it's usually Lulu. In fact, it's always Lulu. And so I always give them that option. So it's really important to talk to the student and other key stakeholders, such as their parents, siblings, and their other teachers. I find what's really interesting is now that the kids have a new name for their friend and their friend is free to answer to that name, nothing much has really changed. They sometimes will wear a leotard or a wig or a special belt, waist cinching belt, but apart from that, yeah, nothing much has really changed. They are the same student that they ever were. They're quite comfortable. And I think because people haven't made a big deal out of it. But that's what this student needed. Other students may need a bigger deal made out of it. I think it's just really important to talk to that student and their family. Myself, this student's friends, and all other staff in the school refer to this student as Lulu. And at the end of the day, that's all we really want, is for this student's new identity to be acknowledged, but not singled out.
Hi, I'm Catherine Smith. I work at the University of Melbourne in the Youth Research Centre, and I am here today to talk about a few research projects that I was involved with during the COVID-19 pandemic, and the way that we kind of heard from people's voices within the community about the experience of kids with disability in education. The first project that I want to talk about was one that was done with CIDA, with the Children and Young People with Disabilities Advocacy Group, and colleagues from the University of New South Wales, looking at the incoming survey about education from just over 700 families from across Australia. It was interesting, and I think that it's been echoed through a number of surveys throughout the pandemic experience across sector, that people use the opportunity to use in-text answers to write extensively about their experience. So while it was a survey, we had a lot of text, over 1,000 like in-depth text responses to work with as well, which really gave it some depth of experience. We learned that many young people weren't contacted by their schools at the beginning of the pandemic, and that those that were, many of their parents talked to us about the fact that there was a lack of material that was suitable for the young person. Now, this is not a big surprise. The pivot was really difficult for people, and we know that there was a inequity across schools depending on how digitally enabled schools were, with regards to the ability to kind of get material out there. But what came across in the majority of the responses was that kids weren't getting material that was adapted to their functional needs of education. And when parents got in touch with schools, and often the onus was on parents, for the first kind of month and a half of the pandemic, where we were locked down and kids weren't able to go to school in person, often young people had little or no contact with their peers. And even when there was peer contact going on, the young person with a disability was sometimes discluded from that. The positive side of that was that where there were kids who were involved in 2 or more interventions, so if they were kind of going to an early morning class or a touch-in with their kind of a cohort, and then they were getting something adapted in work, or if they were in touch with a learning intervention aid, or something like that, then they were a lot more likely to stay engaged in school. What we've started to see in a second project now, with NOSL, that's funded by the MDI, is a smaller project based in Victoria, which is of course the only state in Australia that has kind of had multiple lockdowns. We've seen that in the second wave, there seems to be some change in people's experience. So it's clear that, you know, there's a will to make these changes. What I think is important to kind of learn from these experiences, and also the experiences of a third group that I've been working with at YDAS, young people, that's a group of only young people, and young people's voices are quite strong within that community. And what we've come to find is that we don't have enough young people's voices talking back to the experience yet. So that group is working towards their own research project to kind of capture the voices of young people. But also what we can see across the board is that there's still a real kind of deep indirect form of psycho-emotional disableism that's evident across this, in that kind of not meaning to, but still not being able to, or not originally kind of altering the materials or creating materials that are accessible to kids with disability in the first instance. So it's quite a secondary part of practice, and often needs prompting before it actually happens. So it indicates to us that there's room to really kind of skill up the workforce in ways to kind of continue this work. One of the concerns that has happened in the second wave in Victoria is that there's been a real push in kind of getting IEPs or ILPs, individual learning plans that kind of talk to adapting to the functional needs of learning, up and running. It's not clear, and indeed it's of some concern, that that continues to be more of an accountability check. And some of the parents that we've talked to already kind of in the second round of interviews have indicated that yes, they've had a student support meeting, but that the IEP has continued to not really be a living document. It's still kind of something that exists within the bureaucracy of the system rather than the lived experience. So I guess ideally, what we've learned from COVID is that it would be great if we could work more in line with what the evidence base tells us with regards to enabling young people's voices and their parents' voices to talk to the way in which they engage with the materials that are appropriate to their developmental stage at school, and think a little bit about the way in which we do that work better. We have a large cohort now of carers that have worked quite closely with young people around their education and their education goals. So maybe there's probably an opportunity now where we're so connected via the internet, perhaps more than we've ever been before between family and school, to take that opportunity to really kind of adapt and capture those voices and think about the ways in which we work going forward.